Welcome to another episode of the Prague Finance Institute podcast, where we explore the pressing issues shaping the global economy and geopolitics. Today, we're diving into what could be one of the most important shifts in US economic policy: Donald Trump's return to power. What might this mean for the US economy, global markets, and the delicate balance of geopolitics? Joining us today is a very special guest, Mr. Marc Chandler, one of the world's foremost experts on foreign exchange and global capital markets. With over 30 years of experience, Marc has served in leading roles at major financial institutions and authored acclaimed books. Marc is currently the chief market strategist at Bannockburn Global Forex. Previously, he was the global head of currency strategy at Brown Brothers Harriman, HSBC, Mellon Bank, and Deutsche Bank. Marc is also a professor at New York University and the author of two insightful books, Making Sense of the Dollar and Political Economy of Tomorrow. Stay with us as we discuss everything from tariffs and labor markets to trade wars and geopolitics. Marc, let's get started and welcome to the podcast of PFI.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. We're gonna start by asking you the first set of questions on the US economy. What is your quick assessment of the current state of the US economy in terms of growth and inflation for 2025? And especially after what happened yesterday at the Federal Reserve, how do you see the Federal Reserve navigating monetary policy under a Trump administration, given his past criticism of rate hikes and his fiscal, trade, and labor policies that could create new challenges for inflation control?
Yes, isn't that like a mouthful? Like, what incredible changes are likely in store for us? And I think you're right. At the FOMC meeting, they were very clear that the anticipated rate cuts that they thought were likely in September, 100 basis points. Now the Fed says maybe only 50. But to your point, I think it was most telling that when pressed on it, Powell explained that some of the Fed officials try to anticipate the impact of the fiscal impact of Trump's administration. Some Fed officials did not, and other officials didn't say whether they did or they didn't. So we're really left with a bit of a quagmire, and I think it's not very clear. The market, though, sees the U.S. economy relatively robust, and that is to say, higher interest rates, and they fully accept that the Federal Reserve won't cut as much as they previously thought. You know, through early parts of this the last couple of years of this part of the cycle, the market has been more dovish than the Federal Reserve, but it began being a little bit more hawkish. What we've seen happening really is the labor market seems to be slowing very gradually, but the improvement in prices, that is to say, the decline, the moderation in the measures of CPI, PCE deflator, have been slowed. And this is once again suggesting that maybe the 6% budget deficit the U.S. runs keeps the economy running too hot to get inflation down, but maybe too slow to really like speed up the labor market. So we're in a positive position compared to almost everybody else. I think, Keynes talked about the markets being like a beauty contest, not to pick who we think is the most beautiful, but to pick who everybody else is going to think is the most beautiful. I'm afraid that right now we have a bit of an ugly contest. And it just so happens that the U.S. is less ugly than other countries.
Thank you. So let's dwell now a bit more into Trump's next presidency policy. If Mr. Trump introduces or expands the tariffs, particularly on imports from China, how could this disrupt the supply chains for the U.S. industrial sector?
Yeah, this is really a very important question for a lot of Americans too, businesses, but also foreign countries. And I think there's a misunderstanding. And here's where I think the core of the misunderstanding is: one little factoid. About half of the U.S. imports come from U.S. companies abroad. What this means is that, not to tell a history lesson or anything, but U.S. companies service foreign demand primarily by building locally, selling locally. This has been true since the early 1960s, where the sales of the affiliates of U.S. multinationals exceed U.S. exports. And the reason the U.S. went with this direct investment strategy is historic reasons: protectionism after World War II, the strength of the U.S. dollar, all encouraged putting production offshore. So the tariffs that Trump is talking about, I think, is partly aimed, yes, at other countries, but the real target, and he's made no bones about this, that his real enemies are domestic. And that is to say, he's critical of this neoliberal idea that nearshoring or friendshoring is good. He insisting on onshoring. That is, the U.S. Imports cars from Mexico, and he says we should have those cars that are being made in Mexico made in the U.S. Same kind of story with China, and Mexico sees this. The U.S. complained about Mexico's imports from China, and Mexico responded and said half of the companies, or the companies that are responsible for half of our imports from China, are American companies. So the first thing I would say is, when you're thinking about Trump's tariffs, is to recognize that this is an unwinding or an attack on the neoliberal approach of foreign direct investment, which means for many people the loss of manufacturing jobs in the United States. I partly disagree with that. I think manufacturing jobs have been lost mostly to technology. China has lost manufacturing jobs. The world has lost manufacturing jobs. And I think that, when I was younger, I thought, wow, wouldn't it be good to have a secretary who would remind me when my anniversary is, to do errands for me? And it turns out that the secretaries now are not in China. Microsoft has replaced them with Office, with Outlook, with Word. And so I think that I think you're right that we're on a new era. And I think that after years of the neoliberals, I think that Trump partly represents a pushback against neoliberalism in economics. And this is to say, more tariffs, more to trade protectionism, more onshoring, less nearshoring, and friendshoring.
Okay, but to continue with the subject, what would happen to global trade if China and other countries retaliate?
Yes,
We
I think
we saw just to add a comment here in the 30s, we had the same thing. I think that the US increased tariffs on European countries, and the European countries have retaliated, and global trade has collapsed.
yes, I think that when we talk to our children about what to do in the face of a bully, and I think the U.S. policy looks like being a bully to other countries. We tell them stand up to bullies, and I think that we saw this very clearly before Trump has even gotten in office. Shortly after he was elected, he sent out a tweet that talked about tariffs not on China, but on Canada and Mexico. And Canada responded. Prime Minister Trudeau flew down to Florida to talk to Trump and his advisors. He was mocked. It was talked about as Canada being a 51st state. Mexico has the first Jewish female president, and she wrote a letter back that was firm, polite but firm, pointing out about the trade, about how U.S. companies would be impacted by tariffs, talked about how fentanyl has fallen going over the Mexican border, talked about how immigration has fallen going over the U.S. southern border. She had gotten respect, and the markets responded positively, where they took the Mexican peso back to where it was close to the U.S. election before Trump's tweets. On the other hand, the Canadian dollar has fallen to new multi-year lows since COVID. And so I think that the lesson, I think you're right. We should expect other countries to retaliate against U.S. tariffs. And this is a case of really, we talk about equilibriums. And we'll find ourselves at a suboptimal equilibrium. The benefits of trade, which partly explains low inflation, our rising living standards, will be challenged. It's already being challenged on the margins. People talk about globalization, meaning how globalization is slowing, and that the protectionism, the people because it's not just the US that wants to have onshore. Why should China become dependent on or stay dependent on semiconductors or two operating systems, OIS and Android? Countries, I think, after COVID want to have certain medical supplies, devices built close by, have mRNA technology of their own. And so I think that after this big phase of globalization and putting production outside countries, I think we're going through a period of economic nationalism. I think this would mean slower world growth. It might not mean high inflation. Partly, I think about Trump's first term, a lot of tariffs, but we still had low inflation. Partly, it's that the tariffs were really targeted to two types of things: intermediate goods and consumer goods that there were available substitutes for. So it turned out to be not so inflationary. But the widespread threats this time could become inflationary. Just we need to see the details. So I think that this leads to a greater degree of uncertainty, which in the markets means higher volatility.
Okay, thank you for the answer. But also, Trump policy is about the labor market and immigration. So if we have like stricter immigration policy and deportation of millions of workers, wouldn't that be inflationary also?
Yes, it could be. You hit the spot. I think it could be inflationary. It need not be inflationary because partly, I think that we have to. I think there's three categories in which Trump's threats can fall into. One is that these are principles, like evicting immigrants from the U.S. Secondly, or putting tariffs. It could be like principled positions for him. Secondly, it could be political rhetoric. Thirdly, it could be negotiating stance. And many people think about Trump as the deal maker, and how much he wants, how he thinks of himself as a deal maker, wants a deal, and by showing that he's willing to throw away tariffs, it's really like partly in game theory. He's showing that he's willing to hurt himself to get what he wants. Like, if you don't stop doing this, I want to shoot myself in the foot. And I think that there's a logic to it. I'm not sure that he's going to be able to execute all these things he's saying, because he does have these conflicting policy goals. On one hand, he knows that part of the reason he won the election is because of high inflation. And so if he does these things, high tariffs, make them inflationary, gets rid of an important part of our workforce, we'll have more inflation. And that'll mean higher interest rates, a stronger dollar, which goes against a lot of his ideas. So I think that this is why I think we're sort of stuck here, this uncertainty, that he's got conflicting policy objectives, and we're not sure how it's going to settle down. But I think that what this means for investors is that the unknown that's really, in some ways, the biggest risk, the biggest threat for investors comes from the unknown. And I think that this unknown hangs around for quite a while. For example, not just on these immigration tariffs, but it's also on his tax bill that was passed in his first term that expires, that need to be renewed. Will he renew it early on? Will the tariffs be used to pay for that, so we have a smaller deficit? Are we just going to? He's talking today about lifting the debt ceiling, abolishing it. Are we talking about larger U.S. fiscal deficits? It's just not clear yet how it falls out, because there's so much conflicting things, because we treat Trump. I'd say that the two takeaways is, one, we treat Trump like other politicians, where guardrails are like in tradition, the status quo, how we do things, inertia. And the other thing I think we've learned about Trump is that we have to take him seriously, but not literally. He doesn't use language the way a currency strategist like myself would, where we so many shades of blue, where you tell someone that's a blue pen or a blue piece of paper, you're still not exactly sure what that blue is. You might call it sky blue, navy blue, baby blue. Trump uses language in a much looser way. And it's more about images and aspiration than the actual meaning of the words.
I totally agree with you, and there are a lot of contradictions in his policies. Actually, I posted something on LinkedIn a few days ago, enumerating the number of contradictions in his policy. But I will start with the first one. And you are right that his language is mostly to the masses than to strategists or economists. He wants the masses to listen to him. One of the famous sentences that he repeats is "drill, baby, drill." Now, first of all, is it feasible in the short term? Because raising oil production by 3 million barrels a day, it cannot happen from one day to another. And second, it also has an impact on oil exporting countries. Many of these countries are allies to the US. So what do you think about this first contradiction?
Yes, so I think that my understanding, I'm no oil expert, but my understanding is some of the technological advances in the shale space, which is the real like game changer, are being exhausted. Without more technology advances in the pipeline, the U.S. might be in the next year or two near peak oil, and I suspect it'll be much less than 3 million barrels addition that Trump has suggested. But I do think two things I think follow. One is that there's places that we have not drilled that are regarded, like whether it's national parks, preserves. I think that Trump won't respect those traditions about protecting those spaces unless forced to by courts. The second thing, though, I think with this is that our allies in the Middle East who want higher oil prices and who keep OPEC Plus keeps postponing the increase in output. This is a real struggle, but this is the sort of ongoing struggle between non-OPEC producers and the OPEC producers. And it's not just the U.S., Brazil, Guyana, Norway, Canada, so that OPEC seems to control less and less of the market. And I think with the world economy, one of the things that would help the world economy is cheap energy. And quite the opposite is taking place. Even today, we've got a jump in U.S. nat gas. Europe is still paying something like 50% more for their energy than the U.S. is. I suspect that Trump and his team will be more sympathetic to nuclear power. And so I could see that as well. I think that Europe, I think that's really the key to European energy independence. I don't think that Europe is quite ready for it yet. But I think that you've seen already tensions between Norway shipping gas, French shipping electricity. What's Germany? Germany's still like early in our careers, Germany was regarded as the weak man or the sick man in Europe. And once again, it's really a drag. And the key partly, I think, is its need for energy, for its manufacturing to be able to do so competitively. So this is a big issue. I think energy is really one of these keys to the global economy. And cheaper energy, the idea is that cheap oil, though, slows down the development of alternatives. Europe is well ahead, it looks like, of alternatives. I know several countries, Spain, Portugal, getting sometimes more than half their energy from these renewables. And I'm afraid that one of the consequences of Trump's tariffs, especially on China, is going to really slow down the U.S. movement towards a more environmentally friendly policies, whether it's tariffs on solar panels, whether it's the tariffs. I mean, we don't have Chinese cars on U.S. roads. Other countries do. And so, I worry about this, that the economic nationalism that we were talking about will conflict with some of the environmental and green goals that the U.S. and other countries may have.
Okay, and now we're gonna go to another contradiction, and actually it was worded by the new Secretary of Treasury. He wants to achieve a 3% deficit, meaning a drop in the primary balance of almost 4 percentage points of GDP. And in the same time, he wants to achieve a 3% growth rate. Myself, as an economist, I did not understand how he can achieve that. Can you please, elaborate on this new fiscal policy objectives?
Yes, I think it's a contradiction. I think that part of the reason that even the IMF says the U.S. economy has been growing so much better than, say, Europe and Japan has to do with our large fiscal deficit. I think that the from the Trump administration, my sense is that they think that a lot of savings will be made through cutting government spending, and that's why you've got the richest man in the world telling the U.S. now what programs it should afford and what programs it can't afford. I worry that if there was an idea tomorrow, someone said, let's have a room people could go to. They can escape from the outside, cold weather. They can sit in this large room and they can borrow things with just their signature. I don't think we have the civic sensibilities anymore, at least in the United States, to have public libraries. We've really done away with public restrooms, public drinking fountains. We're talking about privatization. The Trump administration's talked about getting rid of some departments, including the post office, the Department of Education. I can imagine Musk is also campaigning to get rid of one of these military projects, making the latest fighter jets. So I think that from the Trump administration, they think that they can cut enough out of the budget, cut spending, privatize programs, get it off the Federal Reserve's, get it off the federal government's balance sheet, raise tariffs, raise revenue through tariffs, and that will help reduce the budget deficit. I don't find it very compelling. I didn't vote for Trump. I should admit that. But I think that people who did vote for Trump aren't really concerned so much about these details. If we have a smaller or larger federal deficit, I'm not sure that that's really going to decide how people are going to vote in the midterm election, which is the next big play in 2026. I think that we'll ask ourselves that in 2026, though. Are we better off or not? And I think that many people, one of the best predictors of how people were going to vote in this past election was if they were better off, where they lived in a county that had a higher GDP per capita today, or say November, than they did before COVID. And if they didn't, they voted for Trump more likely. And this is, I think we'll face this again. So it's not so much how are they going to resolve these contradictions, but can they deliver the goods? Can they get Americans to be living longer and wealthier? And I'm not convinced that these policies are going to achieve that, but this is what we're going to find out in the next couple of years.
Okay, so now we are debt to GDP ratio, debt held by the public around almost 100% of GDP.
Yeah.
Listening to you and listening to other experts, no one seems to be convinced that the budget deficit will be lowered. So, given the CBO projections, this path it seems to be unsustainable. So, what is left then? And that will take me to the other subject, which is more geopolitics and reserve currency. But what is left to do? Financial repression?
Well, I don't know. I think that politicians, respond when their feet are in the fire. And I think that despite the large U.S. budget deficit, despite the debt, I don't think that, and I fully agree, and I think almost everybody I think who watches this agrees that U.S. fiscal path is not sustainable. But that doesn't mean it has to end today or tomorrow or even the next couple of years. I think that if investors were truly worried about the U.S. deficit or the U.S. debt levels, interest rates would be much higher, especially at the long end of the curve. And right now, the difference between our 2-year and our 10-year bond is about 25 basis points, which is not very much. In fact, it was inverted until very recently. And so I think that so it's really a question in some ways, where are the bond vigilantes? And I don't think that they're there yet. I think of course, it's sort of like the weather. People talk about it, but don't do anything about it. Similarly, people might complain about the budget deficit. They might worry about it, but the markets, the collective wisdom of the markets is that it's not yet reached or approached a tipping point. And so that means that a year from now, 2 years from now, we can have the same conversation, talk about the large U.S. deficit, the large U.S. debt, why it's not sustainable, but that still the real impact, the real price to pay is not there. And I know people are concerned that the U.S. now is spending more money on servicing its debt than on defense, for example. Interesting idea, but think about where this money goes that we pay interest. So the federal government pays interest on its debt. Who gets this? Who are the biggest owner of U.S. treasuries? Americans. Social Security. Rich people who are buying T-bills and buying bonds because the savings account, the savings rates are the savings rate that they get from the banks is too low. They go into money markets, buy the T-bills, buy bonds. And same thing with military. When the U.S. gives military aid to Ukraine, for example, what does Ukraine do with that money? They buy U.S. weapons. And so I'd rather encourage your viewers to think about this in a dynamic fashion. Where does the money go? So the U.S. has a large deficit. Its expenditures exceed its revenues. And where are those expenditures going? And in some ways, it's a type of what I'd call like military Keynesianism. We spend the money, but it's really the money comes back to the U.S. and helps stimulate the economy. And so you really have to follow. I think the rule of thumb would be follow the money. And a lot of these expenditures, military expenditures, debt servicing, ends up coming back into the U.S. and stimulating demand.
True, but recently, or maybe over the last few years, we saw a drop in the official buying of U.S. treasuries, be it foreign central banks or the Fed. Actually, the Fed is dumping the treasuries on the market. And we see the share of domestic investors skyrocketing, going to 28% of the total. Does this mean that price discovery of the bond market will be better, will improve, and because domestic investors, they go after yield? They don't have institutional or political motives to buy treasuries.
Yes, I think you're right. I think that as the new investors of U.S. Treasuries shift around, I think that price discovery. I think these are more price-sensitive investors. But I think that I don't think that foreign central banks are not buying treasuries because of the U.S. deficit or U.S. debt level. I think that central banks are accumulating less reserves for various reasons. OPEC, low price of oil. China is not accumulating the reserves that it used to. It's gotten more efficient in managing its reserves. So I think that central banks. This is the irony. I think following the markets for so long, central banks buy treasuries, partly in intervention, to stop their currencies from appreciating. But we're in a strong U.S. dollar environment where the foreign currencies, say in East Asia, like South Korea, a record low, India, record low currency values against the dollar. So these central banks have less wherewithal to accumulate reserves, and then the U.S. gets its share of those reserves. So I think that the fact that more are held by private citizens, less by foreign central banks, speaks to that we've been in a strong dollar rally, and external imbalances, leaving aside the U.S. and China, have not really been growing as much as they did in the past.
Okay, thank you again. Now we would like to go through maybe the most juicy segment of our podcast, which is geopolitics, knowing that you authored two important books, and you are a political economist. So I'm gonna start by the first question. What are the probabilities of China-US war? Not trade war, physical war.
Yes, I think that our ability as a species to hurt each other and to act warlike knows very few bounds. But I think that neither the U.S. nor China are ready for a direct confrontation. So where would a direct confrontation be? Fortunately, unlike China and Russia, we do not share a border with China. China and Russia share a border, and they've had clashes. India and China share a border, they've had clashes. The US does not share a border with China, and so that helps ease the likelihood or reduce the likelihood of some immediate or initial confrontation. Most people would think that the confrontation takes place over Taiwan or in the South China Sea. Maybe it's the Philippines. It's somewhere off the Chinese border where the U.S. is going to defend its allies. We have, as you know, the U.S. has a security alliance with South Korea and the Philippines. We don't have one with Taiwan, and this is going to be the interesting issue, I think. President-elect Trump has not shown the unequivocal support for Taiwan as past presidents, and China may want to probe that. And already we see China having escalating. It's like I want to say it's like harassment of Taiwan, the Philippines, and Japan. But I think that a direct confrontation is still not the most likely scenario. I think a high degree of this like probing, sort of like remember maybe in high school we had to dissect a frog, and we cut the frog open and we put a little bit of electricity around different parts of it, and we could see its muscles move, sort of like probing, looking for weakness or strength. And I think that's what happens when the U.S. or China or Russia fly an airplane into each other's airspace. You sort of see how they respond. And so I would consider this. I think that war is best conceived as an escalation ladder. And of course, with this cyber warfare, I think we're already on the lower rungs. But the actual boots on the ground shooting war might be still several rungs away. And I don't see that as the most likely outcome, at least in the next, say, few years, say, call it Trump's second term. It could happen as China probes U.S. commitments. But I'm not convinced that's the most likely scenario. I think that we might find that there might be some areas of agreement that we could find under somebody like President Trump, who threatens so much that maybe it's on medical research. It doesn't look like it could be on environment, despite some of the best efforts. It doesn't look like it's going to be on the economy. So my sense is that we continue to probe for weaknesses on each side, but that an actual shooting war seems unlikely in the near term, thankfully.
Yeah, I do agree. It seems that what's going on in geopolitics is what we call the competing two roads. The one is the Silk Road, and the other one is the Indian Road that was referred to by Prime Minister Netanyahu during the latest UN meeting. My question is now, are we witnessing the creation of the new Middle East? And at the end, where they're going to place Iran? Is it going to be in the sphere of the Indian Road, or is it going to be in the Silk Road?
Yes, I think you're right that there's like these lot of fluidity and alliances. And I think that one of the rules of geopolitics, like we've learned many years ago, is an enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so by having a common rival, that is the US, Russia, Iran, China, can have some forms of cooperation. However, I think that the Middle East has been changed partly by what Israel is doing, what's happened in Syria, and also it seems to me the willingness of Saudi Arabia to still strike a larger deal. So I kind of wonder that out of what's happening in the Middle East, that Russia, I think, is a loser, especially if it loses its bases in Syria. I think that Iran is a loser, given to what Israel has done to Hamas, Hezbollah. I think Turkey, which is also one of these very fluid pieces, it's a member of NATO, but sometimes the U.S. has punished it by denying it certain types of weapons because of its ties with Russia. The EU has this love-hate with Turkey, maybe because it's a large country, a poor country, a Muslim country. Turkey theoretically could have joined the EU. But because Europe hasn't really welcomed Turkey for various reasons, and some good reasons, some we might be skeptical of, but that means Turkey has to be more on its own, navigate between this. So I would think that what's going to happen is that unlike or maybe I should say, like the first Cold War, there's a non-aligned group of nations. And I think that non-aligned group of nations, which really wants to pick both, where you could get the best deal from. In the heart of the Cold War, Egypt wanted to build a dam and put it out to bid. And you would think that Europe or the US would get it because of the engineers or things like that. But instead, Russia built the Aswan Dam. And I think that many countries see China more willing to develop infrastructure than the US and Europe. And so that builds trade ties. But that's really partly the issue. A country like Australia, extensive trade ties with China, but security is obviously deeply wedded with the US and the West. And so I think my sense would be that going forward, the US and China remains the key like antagonists on the world stage. There's some regional players. I think Iran has really had its wings clipped, and it may continue to do so. I mean, I can imagine with some of its proxies like Hamas and Hezbollah being, if not decapitated, demoralized and defeated. That Iran is a big loser in what's happened, I think. I think so is Russia. Turkey, I think, is one of the winners. We'll have to see how they play their cards. I think Israel is going to come out of this ahead too, with its borders safer than they were before. It was never a very popular country. I remember back when we were boycotting South Africa for its apartheid, Israel had supported South Africa and was also regarded a bit of a pariah. And so I'm not sure that there's degrees of pariahness, so to speak. But I think Israel comes out ahead as a regional power, safer borders. And I'm not so sure that the U.S. is a loser in all this. I mean, its key rival, Iran, has been hurt by Israel. Russia is in Ukraine. I don't see how this is going to work out very good for Russia, even if they were to take all of Ukraine. I think that the animosity between Europe and the hostility remains for quite a while, and the ramifications of freezing Russian reserves and repurposing them. It's not just the US, it's not just the EU, but even Switzerland, who broke their own neutrality to punish Russia. That Russia hasn't. It might take the end of Putin's era to bring Russia back into the fold and talk and have a negotiation of how they can be back into sort of a group of industrialized, responsible nations.
Well, this is a very important subject because this is what I was going to open with you right now, Russia and Europe. I mean, even if Mr. Trump succeeds in bringing a peace between Ukraine and Russia, as you said, the animosity is there and the lack of trust is there for many, many years to come. The question is that how will Europe replace the Russian energy supply? I know that they've been now relying on LNG, but LNG is very expensive, and this has already affected the European industrial sector. We see it. We see levels of industrial confidence in Europe at recessionary levels. So, I mean, there must be a solution for that problem in Europe.
Yes, I'm afraid it's going to take several years. You can't just build nuclear plants. You can't just build these liquefied natural gas. But there's something else that's going on. It's almost like kabuki theater. Here's what I think about the kabuki theater. Russia sells their oil to India. India refines it, sells it to Europe. Europe still has it, but now there's a middleman and it becomes more expensive. And so, in all this talk about limits on oil and gas from Russia, there's a back door. Europe is still consuming Russian oil and Russian gas. It just comes from India. I think it's it's sort of like a mockery. It's the same thing though. But I think people don't really appreciate how much this interdependency still exists. For example, the U.S. still gets its refined uranium for nuclear weapons from Russia. We get important materials for weapons from China. China is now beginning to have some export blocks to it, like on graphite. But so yes, there's embargoes. Yes, there's a lot of animosity, but I think the commerce still goes on, even if it's in a less clear, more clandestine kind of fashion. And I think that we as people can go on and fooling ourselves by saying, "Oh, we've blocked Russian oil," when we're really buying it from India instead. So I am concerned about the long-term future of that relationship. Russia is part of Europe. Russia is not going anywhere. It's not going to be part of NATO. It's not going to be part of a free trade agreement with the U.S. or Europe. Russia is a European power, and I think that what it's doing on the board is not just sort of Ukraine. It's not just Georgia. You saw what happened in Romania. I'm not crazy about the Romanian court overruling an election because of Russia's involvement on TikTok ads. But the idea that Russia it's got its hand caught in the cookie jar too many times. And by that, I mean, of course, I can't say that the U.S. has clean hands and doesn't try to influence elections through both clandestine and overt measures. But Russia does it in a more clumsy fashion. And for that, it gets punished. And I think that leads to mistrust in Europe. Interfering with elections is really I think the U.S. does it. I think other countries do it. Russia does it, but like I say, in a clumsy way. And I think it really irks and angers Western Europeans.
To continue on Europe, the rise in nationalism. Like we started with, I think, Netherlands, then Italy, then France, then Germany, and governments are falling one after the other. Now, and many of these political parties, they kind of have an issue with the euro and with the EU as a center of European institutions. Do you think that there is a probability that over the next few years, if things are not being done properly, this euro project might fall apart?
There's Americans. I think about Milton Friedman. When the euro was just being born, Milton Friedman had an essay and said, if this euro experiment fails, there's going to be war on the continent. I think what my understanding of it would be something like this. The European unity project is not an economics. The economics is secondary. The politics. And the politics is this key question that's been around for roughly 200 years. And that question is what to do with Germany. And we have there's this like quip that says that you got to pity Germany, too big for Europe and too small for the world. And I think the way I understand the European project is the Lilliputians are trying to tie Gulliver down into a network of relationships. And so I was among the few Wall Street economists who thought that Greece was not going to get kicked out of the Eurozone during its crisis, because people, my colleagues, focused on economics, and I really focused on the political will, the political desire, and that if Greece were to be evicted, it'd make the door a lot easier for the next one and the next one. And so what I marvel at, to your point, is that despite Meloni coming to power in Italy, there's no talk about Italy leaving the Union. In France, yes, I know that Le Pen hasn't been reconciled with the EU yet, but she is supporting the new prime minister that is more pro-Europe. I think you're right, though, that nationalism is on the rise. Economic nationalism, but not just economic nationalism. The immigration issue is not just a big issue in the U.S. election campaign, but seems to be a big issue in many of the European elections as well. And this also speaks to a type of nationalism. It's sort of strange, right? When I'm nationalistic, it's called patriotism. But when you're nationalistic, it's exclusionary nationalism. It's dangerous. And so we talk about this. It's almost like a double set of standards. But I do think that we have to anticipate further rise of nationalism. I don't think that meme has peaked. And I think that you're right that it's not just to me that the right wins these elections, but that the incumbents lose. And I think that this is really, people are angry at their elites. They haven't delivered the goods. And I think you see this in France, you see this in Germany, you saw this in the Great Britain when they had an early election, and you had a sense in the U.S. too that Biden did not deliver the goods to Americans, whether it's inflation or other policies. And so I think that you vote out the old bums and elect new bums and have to keep doing that process. So I think that nationalism is on the rise. Doesn't necessarily mean the end of the European experiment. And that experiment continues. We're still here, monetary union without fiscal union. And I'm not so sure we're any closer to fiscal union in Europe. And the most recent discussion seems to be a joint bonds for military purposes that would be voluntary, and it could include non-EU countries like the UK or Norway, for example. But this is not the kind of vision, I think, that many of us had with with COVID and the joint bond issuance. The idea of a fiscal union still not there.
Okay, my last subject is the dollar role in global finance. I mean, we have a lot of talk about the possibility of a reserve currency competing with the USD. Personally, I don't think that a reserve currency that is not backed by democratic governments can succeed, but I would like to have your opinion on that. And then we will move to the CBDC to see if the developed world central banks will be able to develop these kind of currencies.
Yeah, so first, I guess your first question is really about the reserve status of the dollar, what's happening with that. There's a lot of pretenders or challenges. I think that, you and I both use the same keyboard, QWERTY. Yet people tell me there's a better keyboard out there, more ergonomically designed. Your fingers have to do less movement. But our keyboard has first mover advantage. And if I'm going to adopt a new keyboard, you're going to teach this old dog new tricks. It's got to be much better, not just marginally better. Same thing with the dollar as a reserve asset. It seems to me that there's nothing that's close to being able to compete with the dollar. Some people say gold. Gold has no yield. So while gold is rising, that's wonderful. But when gold stops rising, you have no yield on your national savings. It's not as transparent, it's not as liquid. I think that if one were to give up, say, we don't want treasuries. If you're going to be selling treasuries and say, well, we'll buy more euros. Sure, there's not a lot of German bunds. Yields are lower. And think about when the U.S. has an auction. When there's new debt being issued, an auction might be $50, $60 billion. The European bond market is more like the U.S. muni market. A lot of different issuers. They all have their own little rules. And the size tends to be small. And too small, I think, for some of these large pools of capital, sovereign wealth funds, reserves, central bank reserves. And so I don't see on the horizon any country or countries that can really challenge the dollar as the single most important reserve currency. Yes, the euro is a reserve currency. The yen is a reserve currency. Sterling is a reserve currency. The Swiss franc is a reserve currency. Canada and the Australian dollar are reserve currencies. Chinese RMB is a reserve currency, but still way too small to really rival the dollar. I'm not so sure. I mean, I hear what you say about democracy, and I can't find a reserve currency that doesn't have a democracy. But at the same time, what does a democracy mean? When the U.S. was founded, up to the first 100 years of U.S. presence, we had slaves, and yet we consider ourselves a democracy. Women didn't get the right to vote till after World War I, yet we were a democracy. Whatever democracy means, it seems like it's always a work in progress, expanding the franchise. But I think that the key behind the dollar's role as a reserve currency is not the dollar itself, but the liquid depth and transparency of the U.S. Treasury market. So if something were to challenge that, I think that puts the reserve currency at risk. I think that some people talk about crypto, Bitcoin, and there is an effort now in the U.S. By some people to force the Federal Reserve to hold some kind of Bitcoin reserve. I don't think that's going anyplace. I think they have to change laws to do that. I think the only people that would really be helped by that would be the current Bitcoin holders, because if the U.S. has to buy it for reserves, there'd be a big surge in demand.
Well, what I meant by democracy, to make a note here, is that it guarantees you the private property and the rule of law. This is what I meant by democratic countries. And you are right, some democratic countries did not apply very sound economic policies. To go back to the Bitcoin, since you mentioned it, and this is where I want to finish our podcast with the CBDC. First of all, what's your opinion on Bitcoin, and is Bitcoin a currency? This is a question that is being asked by many economists around the world, because as you said, Bitcoin doesn't give yield like gold, doesn't buy you. It's not like something that you can consume. So, what is your view on this virtual currency? Let's put it this way.
Yeah, so economists, we've developed in our profession a certain three functions of money. It's a means of transaction, a store of value, a unit of account. And I don't see crypto, Bitcoin is in particular, meeting those criteria. I don't think it's been around enough to know whether it's a store of value. It's very volatile. And I think there's a contradiction at the very center of it. If you say that there's fiat money like the dollar, the Federal Reserve is printing money like it grows on trees, and you have crypto, you have Bitcoin, and now you have to spend it. You choose which currency you're going to spend out of your wallet. Gersham's law, economics rule, says that bad money chases out the good. And that means that you and I, if we have both crypto and US dollars, say hard currency, we are more likely to spend the fiat money because we think it's going to be a wasting asset. Fiat. So that means we're going to hold on to our crypto, our Bitcoins. And the more we hold on to them, the more we hoard them, the less likely they get the networking effect to be used as a means of transactions. And so, I think, there was a group in the United States many years ago. They called themselves the moral majority. And it turns out that many of those people weren't very moral and they didn't represent the majority. Crypto is regarded as money because they call themselves money. And even on my Bloomberg, they consider crypto currencies. So the functionality would be as a currency. But I think that Powell, Federal Reserve Chairman Powell, had it right in a recent interview with the New York Times, where he suggested Bitcoin was more a rival of gold than it is of the US dollar. And I've developed a sort of what I want to say is a quick smell test. You think about the origins of money, the importance of taxation. When the IRS, that's the US tax authorities, when they are willing to accept my taxes, my tax payment in the form of crypto, I'll be convinced that crypto is money. Now, I know some people will find it. I think there's a small town not far from where you are that was willing to accept some crypto as a payment for taxes, but it was a very limited amount. It was more of like a little feature, a little like a nuance than a real tax payment. And so I think that when the IRS tells me that I can pay them my taxes in crypto, I'll become a believer that crypto is money. Until then, I don't really see the use case for it. That is, what's its purpose in the United States? I can see how in countries that have weak banking systems or capital controls, which maybe speaks to your point before about the rule of law and property rights. If you live in a country that doesn't have those, I could see the benefits of crypto. Or if you have stringent capital control rules, like in China or in India, I can see the case for crypto as a way to escape. But for major industrialized countries, the US, Canada, Japan, Western Europe, I don't really see a strong use case for crypto.
If the Federal Reserve succeeds in creating a CBDC, a central bank digital currency, can they decide from one day to another, like it was decided in the US in 1933, to confiscate all Bitcoins and ban it? I mean, they did that with gold, right?
Yes. So that's why it's sort of like rule of law is kind of a tricky thing. Matt Ridley, who was a science editor of The Economist, he wrote a book about the evolution of cooperation. And one of the things he suggested was that the Ten Commandments, which we're all familiar with, he says that's not about how you should behave. It's about how you want your neighbor to behave. And I think the same thing true is with this crypto is that yes, the U.S. government talks loudly about rule of law, transparency, but like you say, it prevented individuals from owning gold, and it's possible they can ban the use of crypto or the holding of crypto. I think it's highly unlikely. I think that the different regulatory agencies in the U.S. have allowed it, like Bitcoin futures. There's investments in it. And so I think that more likely than banning it, the U.S. just tightens the regulation around it. But it does have this precarious legal position because the more that the crypto fans say it's money, we know that Congress has a monopoly on the issuance of money. So it puts it in this gray area. And I think other countries have the same, you want the central bank or you want officials. I mean, just like there's a natural monopoly on justice. We don't want individuals like you or me to go out and pursue justice. We want to give the state the monopoly of it. And I think when it comes to the coinage of money, the state has to have a monopoly. And so I think that if crypto becomes very successful, people begin regarding it as money, then you've got a problem. While it's in this like nebulous gray area where it looks like it might be an asset where people can buy and sell it, and consumers can be protected from frauds, I think that might be its best place to exist.
True. Well, thank you very much, Mark. That was a very, very useful and educational discussion that we had together. I hope to host you again at the podcast of Prague Finance Institute, and we wish you all the best.
Thank you. Good luck to everybody. Happy holiday.